Welcome back to A Bite from the Money Sandwich, where we provide practical and easy to understand tips and ideas on how to manage your money better, so as to let you retire with comfort and on your own terms. All you hear about today are rising interest rates and how hard it is to get into the property market. Today I speak to Dominic Cavagnino, who is Head of Research and Acquisition at Binnari Property. Dom talks all things property and shares the current market trends he is seeing across Australia. We also speak about the different ways to get into the property market and the importance to just get your foot into the door. Well, good afternoon, Dom. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
Well, you're the property guru, and everyone loves to talk about property. It's a sort of an Australian thing to do. And we're just into spring, and everyone told me, spring is a good time to buy. So it's great for you to be on the show.
Yeah.
Is there something, we've seen the big boom in Sydney, and now we're sort of seeing things in what's happening in Brisbane. Where do you see overall the property situation, especially the eastern coast of Australia?
Yeah, I think it's, as you mentioned, it's one of the things that people love to talk about, right? So we kind of had the interest rate environment dominate a lot of the headlines, with interest rates rapidly rising with 12 consecutive rises, or a fairly strong increase in those figures, and that kind of led to a bit of a market correction probably through last year. But what's been interesting and what people probably haven't realised is that the market's actually really come back quite strongly. There's been a bit of a resurgence over the last 9 to 12 months, and that's really down to things like really strong levels of overseas migration, a lack of new property supply, lower listing numbers, and obviously, as you mentioned, we're coming into spring. That's generally when listing numbers start to rise. But the last sort of 9 to 12 months, we've just seen a real lack of activity in the market, and it's led to more competition basically for the people who have been less affected by the rate rises and who are still in the market to buy or still need to find a place for them and their families to live in. It's just led to those prices really coming back quite strongly. There was an article that came out yesterday that said that in the last 9 months, Sydney's up 11%, Brisbane's up 9%, and Melbourne's up 4%. So on that east coast, our three capital cities are all up over the last 9 months, which I think is a really interesting statistic, because we've been going through a period where the media has basically been telling us that we're waiting on this sort of mortgage rate cliff. But in reality, looking back now over the last 9 months, we've actually seen property prices start to head back in the right direction, despite what's been happening, outside of that in the sort of finance space.
Yeah, and definitely you touched on interest rates, and that's a really big topic at the moment. So we'll come back to that. But do you actually see, therefore, if the property, and it does surprise me, you're saying yes, Sydney especially up 11%. So is it an old wives' tale that spring is the time to sell if you're going to sell or going to buy? What's that? Is that because it's coming up to Christmas? It's a warmer weather. What's your experience on that?
Yeah, I think it's when it comes to times to buy, it probably doesn't make too much of a difference. But I think if you are selling a home, you'd get the advice of your local real estate agent, I'd imagine, just to see when the most activity is within the market. I suppose the one benefit that spring has probably over winter and the sort of summer periods is summer everyone's on holidays or consumed with Christmas and all the other things that go on. Winter can be, a time that people don't tend to be getting out and about to the auctions and open homes, so maybe a little bit less activity. And spring sort of falls nicely into that middle bit there, where you do tend to see more properties on the market and maybe a bit more activity. But from a buying perspective, realistically, anytime you see if you're buying a home to live in, anytime you see the right property pop up, that's the right time to be getting involved, and from an investment perspective, it probably doesn't matter too much. But definitely if you're selling and you're selling a home and wanting to get the best possible results for it, you'd want to be, putting it on the market when you've got the most activity, and spring seems to be that time.
Okay. So you mentioned about interest rates, and we know for a lot of people who are on fixed rates, there is going to be a lot of pain coming shortly, and it is for anyone. It's anyone who I talk to about they've got this situation, definitely go see a broker, go see a mortgage broker, someone who's a specialist in debt. And get their view, because if you're looking to review your mortgage, definitely when your rate rise is about to come to finish is a good time. But we have seen the last 1 or 2 rate rises have stayed level, and hopefully the pain most of the pain is we're sort of at the peak, and hopefully over the next 6 to 12 months, we might even see a slight slowing down or a slight reduction in interest rates.
Yeah.
How do you see that with the property? Because we definitely went through the boom in Sydney, and it surprised me you're saying 11% just in the last 12 months. But what do you think the next 12 months is going to bring, especially when we are seeing about there isn't just enough housing out there?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is the last 3 months when we've had sort of a few interest rate holds in a row, we anecdotally, I've just seen the confidence returning to the market. Investors who are coming to our business are kind of more keen to take action and maybe feel like there's a bit more certainty out there that we are sort of at the peak of that interest rate cycle. There's still talk that there might be one more rate rise, but I think it's pretty widely known now that we are definitely closer to the peak than what we were 6 to 12 months ago in terms of rates. I just think that as much as we've seen Sydney go on a really strong run over the last sort of 10 or 12 years, there have been periods where it's been a bit more stagnant. And it also is worth noting that during that correction, it did come off, 10 to 15%. So it is back up 11, but it's just catching up to where we kind of once were. But it's hard to really see any other outcome than our market's going on a pretty strong run when interest rates do start to come down, because the key fundamentals that are driving the market right now are record levels of overseas migration, and 90% of that lands in Brisbane, Sydney or Melbourne. We've got really strong levels of interstate migration within those three cities. We're creating lots and lots of jobs. People are earning good incomes. There's a lot of money being invested in infrastructure. So all of those sort of key factors are still driving the markets. And if we start to see rates come down in conjunction with those things occurring, then it is likely to be a pretty strong period for the property markets. The other thing is we're just not building enough new property. The challenges that we've had with construction costs and building materials and the labour force being quite strained has led to a real lack of stock hitting the market. And with a real lack of stock hitting the market and that really high level of overseas migration, it comes back down to supply and demand. It's a pretty simple equation. If we've got too many people coming in and we're not building enough for those people, prices and rents head one way. And I think obviously if you throw interest rates onto that as well as something that's coming down and reducing the cost of holding a property, well, that's just going to sort of add even further fuel to the fire, I suppose, in terms of driving property prices up. The one thing I will say, though, is Sydney is obviously at a much higher level in terms of median house prices than Brisbane and even Melbourne. So we might be likely to see Sydney sort of hover around the same kind of mark and not push too far beyond until we see a bit more wage growth and those types of things. But I think for markets like Brisbane and Melbourne, it's looking pretty positive when it comes to the number of people coming in and what we're building and the demand that's picking up in those areas, particularly given the recent results we've seen.
Yeah, and we've had this conversation a few times in that I know whether you're buying your own home or buying an investment property, from the last century when most people could afford to buy their own home for 3 or 4 times their salary, now it's like 10 times salary. So, as a strategy, and when I talk to a lot of my clients or even talking to the adult children of my clients, sometimes, a lot of times you do not want to get into $1 million debt, a $1.5 million just to get your home. Sometimes you just need to think smarter and maybe getting 1 or 2 investment properties over a number of years seems to be that. So even with interest rates going up, that's still a good philosophy. I would imagine you still believe.
Yeah, I mean, we speak to a lot of clients who are that younger generation looking to buy their first home. And a lot of the times the conversation is, well, I'm pretty comfortable either living at home or renting a place with a friend or, with a partner or so forth. And the rental costs are quite manageable. But to go out and then buy a, $1 million apartment in the northern beaches, eastern suburbs or inner west of Sydney, or a $1 million house a bit further out, it's going to leave you exposed to the fluctuations in mortgage costs that come with interest rate rises, and also having a bit more of a set amount that you're going to need to allocate of your income to your mortgage repayments. So investing is a great way to still get your foot in the market and maybe keep your finger on the pulse, but not put yourself under so much stress at those earlier ages. But also, what you might be able to buy in Sydney at that $1 million mark can be not that great when you compare it to what you might be able to buy in Brisbane from an investment point of view. Buying a 1-bedroom apartment versus buying a 4-bedroom house in Brisbane can become a conversation that does tend to sway people to the investment route. But the other side of it is, when you're buying an investment property, one of the key benefits there is that you've got rental income that helps to offset the costs that come with buying an investment property, right? So although your costs might be increasing with rising rates, we've also seen rising rents increase quite dramatically to help offset some of those costs. So it's just an interesting concept, but definitely there's the rise of the rent investor, I believe. A lot of people are
Yep.
going down that path where they are choosing to rent as opposed to purchase their own home. But whilst they're renting, investing in property, whether it be in Sydney or in other areas, to keep themselves in the market and maybe have some exposure to the property market, so that they're not sitting on the sidelines and coming in when things even get more expensive over the next 5 or so years.
Yeah, no, good points. And one of the things I was even just in the last week chatting to a couple, and they were saying, well, how can you talk about 2 or 3 properties? Yeah, and we're talking over 10 years or something like this. So it's not just straight away. I
Yeah.
said, having to save up for my first deposit was so hard. How am I going to save up for my next deposit when I'm also when I may have a little bit extra from the rent to the loan I've got to actually pay as well. And you sort of just got to realize, no, once you're in, once you've got your first property and you allow it a number of years to grow, that will most likely be the deposit for your second property. You'll have enough equity, and you can do things like that when you're actually in the market. So it really is for a lot of people. They've just got to get in. Doesn't have to be that $1.5 million property. You just have to get in, but make sure it's a good property. And we'll talk about the reasons you get advice or getting people so you don't make expensive mistakes. Well, okay, so you're just talking about the trend of rent vesting, and I think that is a great one. Rent where you want to live, but still invest. Don't not invest. Any other trends? I know people I know who have moved from the eastern suburbs and they've moved to the North Shore, or they moved to the beaches, or they're downsizing south or north of Sydney, or going to Brisbane. You must be seeing trends like that.
Yeah, we saw a lot of, during the COVID environment, we saw a lot of people exiting cities and going to those more regional lifestyle places, like the coastal towns and things like that. And that really led a pretty significant boom through, the south coast of New South Wales, the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, all of these coastal destinations that allowed people to maintain their employment in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, but sort of capitalize on the lifestyle that is quite desirable in those coastal areas. So we saw a lot of that. One of the common trends we're seeing at the moment is actually just people in Sydney actually moving up to places like Brisbane in search of more affordable accommodation. And that's actually a reason why, and it's one of the key drivers behind that Brisbane market. We tend to see really high levels of migration when Sydney becomes less and less affordable. So one of the trends we're seeing is the young family households who are, basically growing out of the 2-bedroom apartment they might be living in Sydney and now looking to upgrade, or their ability to upgrade with rising rates and with rising prices in Sydney has become it has become a lot more difficult for them. So they're now looking at alternative options like, okay, well, can I go to Brisbane and maintain a good job, but buy a house for the same price as what my 2-bedroom unit is worth in Sydney and have a much more comfortable lifestyle for my family, arguably better weather and so on and so forth. So we're seeing a bit of that. But, there are always things that are occurring. You'll always have retirees moving to those coastal places. You'll always have the younger generation starting to look at rent vesting as an alternative to buying their own home. And you'll always have those young families starting to look at where they can best set themselves up for a comfortable life with their family as they sort of move into that next stage.
And you must be seeing things like Bank of Mum and Dad, people helping out there and even providing guarantees for that. Because it is, if you are trying to buy something or you are trying to buy your own home, and as I said, some of the people I've seen and they're trying to buy a $1.5 million home straight off. Well, there's the $300,000 deposit you've got to try and find from somewhere. Do you see that's a growing trend, or where do you see that?
Look, for people who have the luxury of having that as an option, most definitely. A lot of the time parents are looking to help their kids get into the market, particularly if they have a preference of them living close by. They tend to be more inclined to help them, but also from an investment perspective as well, right? Like if a client, if a purchaser or a younger person looking to invest is, $30,000 or $40,000 short of where they need to be, we've seen parents sort of help by providing them some money. And it's a good way to actually help yourself get in that market. You can always pay that back if you do have the luxury, which not everyone has, of being able to leverage off your parents a little bit, but then also using things like your parents' home as a guarantor and things like that, just to help you to get in the market. It is important to get creative, because otherwise it can be quite a challenging thing to achieve, getting into the property market, especially whilst everything seems to be continually rising and it seems to be getting further and further away from people. If you can start to get creative around ways that you can get into the market, that can obviously help you, because once you've got your foot in the door, you're much closer to achieving your objectives and actually capitalizing on the growth that can be achieved in property.
And one of the things I learned, which I didn't realize until a couple of years ago, was that if your parents are guarantor, it's only for the amount that is of that guarantee. So if they're helping you with 5%, it's not as if the bank can come back and say, oh no, you've got your guarantor for the whole loan. It's only on for that part of deposit. And hopefully if the property goes up in a couple of years, well, that guarantor just drops off. So
correct. And we've seen multiple situations like that as well, where clients have had their parents as a guarantor for a small portion of the loan, and then basically 2 years down the track, the property has increased in value as we've expected it to, and they've been able to take them off, and then it's there's a loan, and that's just enabled them to get into the market 2 years before and capitalize on that growth, and then they can actually take their parents off, and it's a good result for everyone.
Yeah, well, that probably leads into some of the tips that when you speak to people, and probably more for people who are trying to do this on their own. If they're looking at a property, whether it's here or interstate, some of the tips, and we'll go on to why you should actually get specialist help and how it can make you not make an expensive mistake. But tell me some of the, say, top 2 or 3 tips that you would know or that you learned over the years.
Yeah, I think a big one that I would say is to keep the process as simple as you can. There's so much information out there, and there's so many different ideas around how to be successful when investing. And I often see people looking to buy their first investment property and already trying to think about how they might be able to develop the block of land, or, subdivide and make it a duplex or 4 townhouses and things. And they've never actually purchased a property before that. So I often say to people, just keep it really simple. If you actually buy in an area where you've got a wide range of employment opportunities, you've got consistent population growth, and you've seen fairly consistent property price growth over the years, just buying a good property in one of those areas is going to be a good enough play to help you to get in the market. The more you overcomplicate it, and the more different ideas that you get, and the more different things that you try to achieve all at the same time, it generally leads to procrastinating and not actually doing anything. And that's much worse than buying a property that's just a simple, straightforward, long-term hold type investment, because that's where you're going to get really good outcomes. The other thing I'd say is take the time to do the research. One of the things that people often come unstuck is by buying in locations they might be less familiar with, and not actually taking the time to travel there, speak to local agents, speak to local business owners and local residents, really try to understand the area as a local would, because that can help you to not make mistakes. If you basically buy a property that local owner occupiers are buying in areas where you have a good range and diversity of employment, strong population growth, and consistent property growth, you're never going to go wrong. You may not be have the best performing asset in the country. There will always be properties that perform a little bit better, but there'll be a lot of properties that perform a lot worse. So keeping it simple, I think, is the best piece of advice, because the biggest thing I see is people coming to us with so many different ideas because they've read this book and watched this podcast and watched this video on YouTube, and they've got all these different ideas that it just leads to them confusing themselves and not actually doing anything. But if you keep it simple and buy a good property in a good location, it'll do its job.
Yeah, and you said a good location is, a lot of that's got to be that other owner occupiers, or basically people who want to live there. You're not looking at investors. Correct. You're looking at people who want to actually live there when you say owner occupiers.
Correct.
And I do get it though. People, life gets in the way. It's hard to spend the time. But you've got the internet. There is so much information online, even if if you're talking interstate, if you're in Sydney and you're talking about in Melbourne or Brisbane or the Gold Coast, there is plenty of information online.
Yeah, there definitely is. There's a lot of research sources that you can use. Obviously, it can be quite hard to sort of start from scratch. But if you are starting from scratch, looking in areas that you're familiar with can be a great way to kind of get a feel for the market. Going out and trying to learn about a market that you've never visited or never been to can be quite tricky. But look, there's definitely a lot of information online, and if you get some guidance from someone who is in that space, they can always point you in the right direction around what you should be looking for and things. But if it's your first time doing it and you've never done it before, I would say best to stick with capital cities, because our capital cities around the country, particularly on the East Coast, have typically performed pretty consistently. You're not going to stray too, you're not going to go too wrong if you're in those cities, particularly if you're, there are obviously, I guess, exceptions to the rule. If you don't want to buy in areas where it's completely oversupplied or it's predominantly being purchased by investors. But if you can steer clear of those and focus on capital cities, you'll generally do pretty well.
No, excellent. Now, as I said though before, I've always believed you don't know what you don't know, and it's whether it's getting a mortgage, whether it's buying a property. Geez, even if you're putting a pool in your backyard, it's just one of those things. You don't know what you don't know, and why are you trying to do it yourself? It's amazing the amount of people who say, "Oh, of course, if I was getting my garden, I'd get a landscaper and do that, get it there." But they would say, "But I can go find my own property, which is a $700,000 million possible situation." So here's a chance to tell about Binnari. I've known you guys for years, but just from a buyer's advocate or just from a specialty, why do you see the benefits of someone coming to you rather than they go try and do it all by themselves?
Yeah, look, I think naturally like I said, there's a lot of information out there. So having someone to filter through that and give you a bit of a clear direction can always help. I've always found that when if you're dealing with people who don't have the clarity or the direction or a bit of a plan, it's really hard for them to execute because they're constantly getting pulled into different directions. I think the great thing about Binnari is that we take a lot of the guesswork out of it for investors. So for an investor who's looking at doing something, there is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of different sources of information and different strategies out there. We'll take a lot of the guesswork out of it, and like I said just before, keep it really simple and explain to them how we're keeping it quite simple. Our service doesn't actually cost anything. We charge the seller of the property. So we are similar to a buyer's agent, but a buyer's agent for investors. And through our process, we're actually able to charge the vendor so that there's no cost to the investor and they're not disadvantaged in any way. But by the same token, a buyer's agent is a different strategy, but can also work well. I think just having someone who is a professional in your corner and who is a specialist to what they do will always put you ahead of someone who's trying to do it on their own without the right amount of time or effort going into it. It's our day-to-day job. We can do the travel when we are traveling sort of every week or every 2 weeks to the different locations that we're recommending. So we're going to know those areas and those markets a lot better than what the average person is, just like they're going to know a lot more about their sort of specific occupation than what I am. But I think the key reasons why you would work with us is we would take a lot of the guesswork out of it. We know what makes a market perform strongly. We know what fundamentals you need to look for. We know what makes a property the right type of property. So we can basically just take you through step by step how you can go about buying the right investment property to make sure that you are making good decisions around it. And obviously you can basically take the information that we provide and go and do it yourself, or you can basically work with us on the properties that we are recommending, and we can help people make really good decisions that are going to get them really favorable outcomes when it comes to investing.
Yeah, and I can absolutely say, I've known you for years. You've helped our clients, but there's other buyers advocates and that have been helping our clients too. But it's just having a specialist in your corner just makes such a difference. And I went to an auction only 2 weeks ago, and I saw a couple of the people there that actually had buyers agents who were bidding on their behalf, and it just takes the emotion out of it. Property is an emotional purchase. For a lot of people, it is their dream, and I get that. So having someone there who just says no, even though you might love it, you may think it's the greatest thing there. We'll take the emotion out. We'll see that this is just not the right fit, and there'll be another one. It's just having that, or you don't bid too high for that property. So I can see absolutely why having specialists makes so much, and the reasons you've said exactly for yourselves. Absolutely, it's there. And I actually also just think it's like anything. If you have your friends and you're speaking about it and someone's had a really good experience with a buyer's agent, that's also a great way to find out. But what may work with yourselves may not work with someone else, but that's why. But definitely use specialists.
I think the other thing, Mark, is just, when with us, we are based in Sydney, but we're monitoring various markets. So we don't limit
Mm,
ourselves to a specific area. So for people who are quite open to guidance and open to sort of understanding what options are out there outside of the areas they're most familiar with, speaking to us is a great place to start, because we can sort of point you
true.
in the right direction when it comes to, okay, we're open to anywhere in Australia. Which of the markets are going to be best for us? Talking them through what drives each market, what makes each individual market tick, can then sort of lead into, okay, we feel most comfortable with this city, and we can then provide them advice on those cities because we are traveling so frequently. So having someone who is in your corner doing all the travel and can kind of give you a really wide view of where the opportunities are best in the country, that can always be helpful as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And if people are looking at trends, and as said, you explained about the migration. So when Sydney sort of dropping off or had its boom, so then people are taking advantage and maybe buying in Brisbane, and then it has its boom. If you're sort of looking at the next 5 years, is probably Southeast Queensland, Brisbane, the area, or where do you see?
Yeah, look, it's a market we really like. I mean, Melbourne's coming back from a few years of really low levels of migration,
Right?
just through the COVID period. So they're getting a lot of that back now, which I think will drive that market. The only challenge we see with Melbourne is that there's a lot of land available in Melbourne. So there's not as much scarcity when it comes to new property supply. And when you've got high supply meeting or matching the demand, you can sometimes see that dilute a bit of your potential price growth. Whereas Southeast Queensland is a market which is still seeing really, really strong levels of interstate migration coming out of Melbourne and Sydney, and that's putting a lot of pressure on their property prices. And then you throw into on that as well, you've got the Olympics in 9 years' time, where there's
Of course,
significant amounts of money being spent on infrastructure. That's obviously just creating more and more employment for people up there, and creating a bit of an alternate motive for people to actually make the move up there. It's no longer just affordability that's drawing people out of Sydney and Melbourne. It's actually the fact that in certain jobs like engineers and construction workers, they're so short on labour force up there. You can actually earn more money in Brisbane than what you can in Sydney and Melbourne in some cases, which, might also, coupled with the fact that you can buy a property for half the price, makes it a pretty attractive proposition. So Brisbane's a market that we still see a lot of value in. We've done a lot of work in the Sunshine Coast over the last couple of years, and we saw a lot of growth in those areas. But I think now, coming out of COVID, people are returning to cities. Brisbane's probably the market that we like the most up in that Queensland market.
Wow. Now, every time I speak to you, I always learn something new. So I really do appreciate it, Dom. I've taken up enough of your time. One thing we always finish up on the podcast is asking, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received? For you, it doesn't have to be about properties, but yeah, it could be about properties.
Look, I'm probably a bit conservative by nature, and one of the things that I was told was doing something will always be better than doing nothing. And I often see it with clients, whether they purchase a property through us, or they purchase a property on their own, or they purchase a property using another buyer's agent. That doesn't really matter to us, but what we do know is that doing something will always be better than doing nothing. So I think sometimes it's just about being a bit braver, regardless of what you're hearing in the media, and actually taking action is really important, and that's worked out for me. So
that's great. And a lot of people, unfortunately, they do procrastinate, and you wonder why you're procrastinating on your future happiness or future security. So no, that's a really good one. Appreciate your time, Dom, and hopefully, I'm sure we'll catch up again soon.
No worries. Thanks, Mark.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to know more about Dom and Binnari Property, visit binnari.com.au, that's binnari.com.au, or feel free to email me on admin@themoneysandwich.com, or visit our website, themoneysandwich.com, if you have any questions or would like to learn more. Enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of A Bite from the Money Sandwich? Make sure you subscribe on your platform of choice so you can automatically receive each episode as soon as it's released. As with every podcast, this information is not advice, as not personalised to your own situation. And past performance is never guaranteed for the future. What we are trying to do here is to provide tips, coaching and education to help improve your money knowledge, which we believe can only be a good thing. See you next time when we take another bite from the Money Sandwich.